Chapter 4: The Origins of Limited Government. Givers have to set limits because takers rarely do. Henry Ford. Interpreting the Constitution. If you ask me, my friend commented, I think the gun was the guilty one. Our conversation had corkscrewed into brief commentaries on personal responsibility and individual rights. If guns are guilty of shootings, are cars guilty of hit-and-run accidents? Was my final question before he fell silent and we changed topics. The anti-gun lobby wants to take away citizens' rights to own guns with the argument that it will prevent violent crime and death. But if we applied that same logic to criminalizing the possession and use of automobiles, the outcome would not be safer drivers. It would, however, disable the population from conducting their daily lives with the efficiency necessary to live in large metropolitan areas or rural areas with limited public transportation. Taking away cars would make streets emptier, not safer. Taking something away, such as a gun or a car, doesn't make the object any less dangerous if used irresponsibly. Guns and cars can be very helpful tools in many situations when the operator is adequately trained to operate them safely. The same can be said for other objects which disturbed people are intent on weaponizing. If a citizen can't own a gun, they will use a knife. If they can't own a knife, they will use a rope. If a citizen can't use a rope, they may think completely out of the box and build a bomb. Although laws prohibit crimes like theft and assault, depriving ownership of weaponizable objects doesn't reduce the murderous capacity of humans any more than laws against theft reduce covetousness. It is the inherent corruptibility of human nature for which laws are put in place. The temptation to evil behavior cannot be resolved through legislation, but legislation recognizes and prevents evil from occurring. If people were inclined to good behavior, laws would be unnecessary, which is why laws are written to moral agents, not inanimate objects. People can obey or disobey laws. Objects cannot. It follows that prohibiting objects whose usefulness is determined by the intentions of the person should not be outlawed, but that the people who use with lawless intentions should be penalized. Despite this rationale, why would a segment of the political spectrum want to criminalize the private ownership of guns? Do they really care if citizens want to be able to shoot old soup cans on their farmland? Or hunt pheasant, elk, deer, or other wild game? Or defend themselves against aggressive animals while hiking in the wilderness? Proponents of gun control probably don't care about guns being used for these purposes. In reality, a person with training could use a crossbow to accomplish these activities. But when it comes to using guns against people in self-defense, gun control supporters would say it shouldn't be allowed. Take, for example, the precautions a single parent who has experienced a home break-in may be considering. If you offered a handgun or a crossbow, or even a taser as a home defense weapon, 9 times out of 10, they would choose the handgun. It is lightweight, easy to use, gives the operator more chances of hitting the target faster, and is more effective at neutralizing the threat. Now, think of a hypothetical town, city, or county who has experienced violations of their natural rights for unilaterally pronounced mandates. In this hypothetical municipality, every resident owns a gun. They have also read Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of just war and resistance. They know that they are within their moral bounds to resist a tyrannical leader imposing policies upon them intended to increase his power over them. But the tyrant's patience has worn thin and has decided to enforce policy by deploying the National Guard. In this scenario, Aquinas' criteria for resistance would be fulfilled, and it is likely that an armed militia would be assembled to resist. The kind of scenario gun control supporters feel threatened by is one in which the people strike fear into the government instead of the other way around. And their preferred power differential is that which breeds tyranny. Thus, one who prefers a government with power over the people instead of by the people is inclined to support a totalitarian state in which citizens cannot own guns. Central to gun ownership is the philosophy asserting one's natural right to preserve their life. Training with and using firearms remains a skill that allows people to hunt food and defend themselves from violence, which would be performing the right to life. These are morally acceptable uses of firearms. As we will discuss later, defending the natural right to life is one of the three functions of the government. When civil authorities cannot or will not exercise their responsibility to defend natural rights, this can and should become the responsibility of the individual. Throughout history, militias have proven to be necessary methods of self-defense when governments abuse power. At the center of the debate is how to interpret the Second Amendment. While the anti-gun side argues that guns inherently deprive life, the pro-gun side argues that firearms inherently defend life. One side sees danger, while the other sees the safety guns provide. One also outsources responsibility, while the other embraces it. The anti-gun position assumes the need of an authoritarian government to assert power over any aspect of life it chooses, while the pro-gun position assumes a republican form of government which derives its power from the governed. The context in which the Second Amendment was created can be traced to the Declaration of Independence affirming natural or inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our founding fathers would not have included amendments that subvert the natural rights affirmed in the same document, so we must conclude that when they wrote the Second Amendment, it was meant to defend the right to life. In 2008, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia commented in the majority opinion that the phrase "bear arms" could connote an individual's right to own guns apart from their activity in a militia. Research shows that the history of the English language includes colloquial phrases called binomials or multinomials. Examples of these phrases are cease and desist, lock, stock, and barrel, plain and simple, peace and quiet, or meet and greet. In their 2020 article in The Atlantic, James C. Phillips and Josh Blackman defend Chief Justice John Paul Stevens' dissent, which argues that the phrase keep and bear arms was a new binomial phrase whose prior occurrence could not be verified through any linguistic research. They admitted, however, that the novelty of the phrase could not preclude its intent to combine the rights to keep arms and bear arms, broadening the scope to include militia and individual contexts. The sources they used were the Corpus of Founding-Era American English, COFIA, which contains about 140 million words of text from various American documents published from 1760 to 1799, and the Corpus of Early Modern English, COEME, which covers British English from 1475 to 1800 and includes more than 100 billion words of text. Ultimately, because the phrases must be interpreted in the context of the rights of the people, we can infer that keep and bear arms intended to secure the inalienable rights in individual contexts as well as militias. What does all this have to do with property rights? The way citizens, lawyers, and judges interpret the Constitution will typically reflect their beliefs about human nature, whether people are prone to corruption or virtue. This matters because rulers are also people, and people who are prone to corruption, rather than virtue, are capable of abusing their power. When we interpret the Second Amendment, what matters is the framers' view of human nature. The Founding Fathers were members of a generation who lived under the oppression of King George III, and as such, were intimately acquainted with the human propensity to tyranny. They were men descended from generations which included Presbyterians, Puritans, Mennonites, Baptists, and Quakers who fled the religious persecution of Europe. Undoubtedly, they could recite innumerable stories of persecution. One such story was the expulsion of the Salzburgers. On October 31st, 1731, the Catholic ruler of Salzburg, Austria, Bishop Leopold von Firmian, issued an edict expelling as many as 20,000 Lutherans from his principality. Many propertyless Lutherans, given only 8 days to leave their homes, froze to death as they drifted through the winter seeking sanctuary. The wealthier ones, who were allowed 3 months to dispose of their property, fared better. Some of these Salzburgers reached London, from whence they sailed to Georgia. Others found new homes in the Netherlands and East Prussia. With stories like this, the Founding Fathers understood that humans were capable of great evil when given great power. As Protestant Christians, they believed that evil was inherent and demonstrable in all humans, which separated them from God. This was the nature of sin. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks after God. All have turned aside. Together, they have become worthless, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The framers believed that all humans in a common state of sinfulness could commit atrocities. And sin, when given great power, could easily progress from veiled hatred to socio-political intolerance, eventually resulting in physical violence under tyranny. The generations preceding the Founding Fathers witnessed the coercion, extortion, expulsion, and the murder of defenseless minority people groups. Knowing that power corrupts, they built in defenses against the accumulation of power with checks and balances, term limits, and legal recourse, such as impeachment. The Bill of Rights was another precaution created to protect the natural rights of citizens. It guarantees civil rights and liberties to the individual, like freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. It sets rules for due process of law and reserves all powers not delegated to the federal government to the people of the United States. We will see that considering government's capacity for tyranny as experienced by the Founding Fathers in the generations preceding them, the Bill of Rights was written with the purpose of protecting citizens from the government by placing limits on it. The concept of limited government can be traced to ancient times. While nations with Muslim and Buddhist dominant demographics codified protections based on their dominant religions, the Judeo-Christian groups fleeing to North America in the 16th and 17th centuries had a religious heritage rooted in the Bible. The stories of creation, Noah's Ark, the Judges, King David, the prophets, the crucifixion, and the resurrection were woven into their culture. Their references to these biblical accounts would have been as common as our reference to the Boston Tea Party. One story which would have held special relevance in their time is Israel's rejection of God's choice for a king, from the book of 1 Samuel. I like to call this story God's case for limited government. God's case for limited government. What had been up until that time a decentralized system of government with highly regarded individuals taking the role of seer, prophet, judge, and military commander, often on a temporary basis, Israel was on the verge of becoming a more centralized state with a permanent and professional monarchy and military command structure. With few exceptions, monarchical societies centralized power with the king, who was sovereign over his kingdom and ruled at will. The 17th century Scottish Presbyterian Samuel Rutherford argued that only God has absolute authority and that even the king must obey the law in his book Lex Rex, meaning law is king. The Israelites didn't speak Latin, nor did they use the phrase law is king, but long before they adopted a monarchical model of government, Israel acknowledged God as the author and giver of law. All people were image bearers of God and were subject to his law, even the king. More will be said about the king being subject to law in chapter 5, but this belief implied the concept of rule of law, or law as king. Within a decentralized power structure, individuals who held temporary office were accountable to each other, the public, and God through the statutes given to Moses. While 18th century American colonists would envy this form of decentralized government, ancient Israel wanted a king like every other nation. This would prove to be the key element of Israel's mistake. It is important to understand that Israel did not reject God as their king, but rather rejected God's choice of king for them. Deuteronomy 17:14-20 shows that God approved of a monarchical structure with provisions. 1. The king was to be an Israelite. This meant that the king would belong to the people who recognize the authority of God. This criterion would be used by the Founding Fathers for establishing who is eligible to become president. 2. The king must not acquire many horses. The immediate reason for this criterion was that horses came from Egypt, and horse trading would tempt the Israelites to interact with the pagan people from whom they had been delivered. 3. The king must not take many wives. It was normal in ancient times to seal treaties between kings by intermarriage. Foreign women would influence the Israelites to abandon the unique lifestyle to which God had called them. 4. The king must not accumulate large amounts of gold and silver. God wanted to make sure Israel's king remained dependent upon him for success, and to keep his people from being tempted to compromise their national identity to gain wealth from pagan nations that would be supplying the gold and silver. 5. The king must keep a copy of God's Torah with him to be read throughout his life so he would rule according to God's principles. God's king was to be faithful, separate from the pagans, guiding God's people to righteous living as a shepherd leads his sheep. The broad application of these criteria is that righteous leaders must practice discernment in domestic policy and international relations to avoid economic and cultural degradation, points on which Israel was willing to compromise. It wasn't the demand for a king, but rather Israel's disregard of God's kingly criteria which upset him. Facing a Philistine threat, the Israelites despaired and demanded that the prophet Samuel appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Jewish scholars maintain that the story of David and Saul makes this contrast clear. When the people asked for a ruler such as the other nations had, God gave them Saul, a man who couldn't keep track of donkeys in his care, to show them what their kind of king would be, a self-absorbed failure. Throughout his life, Saul did things to satisfy his own desires and not God's. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to judge us, like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." Ignorant to Saul's character, Israel didn't understand that their resources would no longer be used for the perfect and righteous glory of a deserving God, but for the corruptible personal and political agendas of a prideful man. The resources of the nation would be subject to supporting the lifestyle and opulence that kings are expected to possess. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war, and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards, and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards, and give them to his officers and servants. He will take your male servants and female servants, and the best of your young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." God warned Israel that the king would eventually confiscate their property, conscript their children, and impose a 10% tax on everything, which is exactly what happened to the people of Israel as their new king Saul fought their rivals and enemies. Before he could fight the traditional enemies of Israel, Saul had to unite the squabbling tribes, which he did by threatening to slaughter the oxen of any tribe which refused to submit to his rule. This reveals the nature of humans who assume absolute power. Living in Israel in Samuel's day must have been very similar to living in early 20th century Russia, 1930s Germany and Italy, late 1950s Cuba, modern Korea, or modern China. Totalitarian rulers generally rise to power for recurring reasons. Citizens' disillusionment with government, politicians breaking public trust, economic depressions, and groups being targeted as the source of problems or scapegoating are a few of these. Typically, an individual is chosen by the strongest political party to promise fairness and equity for all. They are seen as society's savior, a phenomenon called the cult of personality. While some leaders are elected, some take control by force, weaponizing the existing institutions and bureaucrats who are in the position to implement systemic compliance with the new policies. Eventually, everyone is forced to comply with the dictator's rules. A common trait among all totalitarian regimes, most clearly demonstrated by communism and fascism, is that the general population eventually becomes impoverished, while the king and his servants, i.e., bureaucrats or the permanent political class, become wealthy. I will discuss this in greater detail in chapter 11. God knew the corruptible nature of humans would lead to the king exploiting his subjects for his own glory and allowing the culture to be corrupted, as would be the case with Kings David and Solomon. Despite his warning, God granted Israel's request. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey their voice and make them a king." Samuel then said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his city." Despite failing to fully grasp the laws, edicts, and mandates they would be subject to from the will of a corruptible human, Samuel gave them hope. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice, and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. The king would have to follow God also. When referring to God, the word fear meant worship and obey. Worship and obedience can be given to anything that holds the position of primacy in a person's life. Notice that Samuel didn't say, "if you fear other people's opinions about you," or "if you fear your employer," or "if you fear discomfort," or "if you fear persecution." Fearing anything or anyone but God is idolatry. It follows that elevating any object above God through worshipful and obedient thought or behavior is idolatry. As I will discuss further in chapter 10, Thomas Jefferson would echo this admonition against idolatry with the phrase, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." Biblical scripture affirms the fear of God as the core of resistance to his enemies. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. At Saul's coronation, Samuel reminded Israel that their individual obedience to God was central to the public wellness of their nation. While Samuel appointed Saul to civic leadership, he did not appoint him to oversee religious matters. From the beginning of the Israelite nation, God envisioned a decentralized government over which he reigned as king, and in which he would set institutions for the specific purpose of worship apart from civil authority. This leads us to the origins of the separation of church and state.